It would become known as one of the bloodiest battles of the First World War. On the first day alone, 57,000 Allied people were killed or wounded. It wasn't ended by brilliant tactical maneuvers, however. It was ended by the weather and the brutal winter of 1916-17. It is the Battle of the Somme. Let's go!
This is bad news. My God.
Falling out right now.
Anything could happen.
Wow. I'll watch the video later.
Feel the heat. I need more knives. I need water.
Ain't dry mopping this.
Hi, I'm Joey the Caribou Weather Dude, and today we're going to talk about how weather affected one of the worst battles of the First World War. If you find these kind of videos helpful, please subscribe and hit like and share and tell a friend. Alright, let's get into it. For 2 years there had been a stalemate along the trenches of the Western Front, with both the Allies and Germans firmly dug in. The idea was to launch a massive offensive to break the deadlock, and it came from General Douglas Haig, commander of the British troops in France, and Joseph Joffre, commander-in-chief of the French forces. It would prove to be one of the worst decisions of the Great War. The battle wasn't supposed to begin on July 1st. Actually, it was delayed by bad weather. The Long Trail website gives a good summary of the bombardment ahead of time, and they summarize the day's weather. On the 24th of June, it was a dull day, low cloud and heavy rain, following thunderstorms the day before. 25th of June, much brighter and warmer day. 26th June, heavy showers return with sunny intervals. Low cloud prevents good aerial observation. 27th and 28th of June, thick mist and heavy rain. Z-Day is delayed by 2 days by agreement between French and British commanders. 29th and 30th of June, the weather brightened, although it was still far from perfect for observing the effects of the firing. The rain was not confined to northern France. Georgina Lee was working a charity fair in Chelsea on June 29th where it rained all evening, undermining their money-raising efforts slightly. On July 1st, the infantry attacked. Nearly 20,000 British and Imperial troops died that day. The UK Meteorological Office was not involved in military forecasting at the outbreak of the war. It began its relationship with the British Army over the course of the campaign. Meteorological staff first entered the war zone after the Battle of Loos. They worked the front lines assisting with planning of Allied gas operations and sending in warnings to alert troops of conditions favorable to German gas attacks. General forecasting for the Army did not start until 24 October 1916. However, Meteorological Office synoptic charts covering Northwest Europe were produced throughout the war. This graphic is part of the synoptic chart for the 1st of July 1916 at 0700 hours. That's just 30 minutes before the first Allied soldiers went over the top. It shows a ridge of high pressure over Europe, bringing warm temperatures, southwesterly winds, and generally good weather. The chart includes observation sites from Germany. It is not clear how these were obtained, but if they were transmitted in code, it is possible they had been deciphered by the Allied forces, as was certainly the case in World War II. So using spy type operations to get weather information. Observations were generally published the day after they were taken, and therefore those for 1st July can be found in the Trench Daily Weather Report for 2nd July 1916. These indicate a warm day with no rainfall. Some places see in 15 degrees, 17s, 18s, 19s, 20s, and if you go down to southern France, down there they were seeing warmer temperatures, even 31 degrees down in Algeria. Although the synoptic chart produced by the Meteorological Office included observations over Germany, the charts in the German Daily Weather Report do not include any observations west of their borders. If the German meteorologists were indeed lacking this data, it would have left them at a significant disadvantage. But of course, most of the weather comes from the west, and if you don't have any weather data from the west, you really don't know a whole lot about what's coming, do you? Here's an original weather chart from the UK Met Office archive showing Saturday, 1st July 1916, the first day of the Battle of the Somme. It's a typical July pattern across Britain and Central Europe. A ridge of high pressure is building through the Bay of Biscay and into France, with a high pressure centered close to Switzerland. Low pressure is shown over Ireland. It was probably west of, and a further area of low pressure over southern Norway and Sweden. A cool day was noted over the British Isles, whilst the weather in France was noted as fair in the morning but misty. The previous day had seen temperatures of 22 degrees Celsius in Paris. On July 1st, 100,000 British troops marched into no man's land. More than 57,000 were killed or wounded that day, many of them cut down by machine gun fire. It was the largest single-day loss of life in British military history. The Newfoundland Regiment, still part of the British Expeditionary Force then, suffered catastrophic losses at the village of Beaumont Hamel at the northern end of the front. Of some 800 soldiers, more than 300 were killed. Only 68 survived unscathed. The Canadian Corps joined the battle on August 30th. 2 weeks later, Quebec's 22nd Battalion, later known as the Royal 22nd Regiment, was ordered to capture Courcelette, a village on the Somme River valley that was occupied by the Germans. It was a suicide mission. The Vendus, as they are known, were the only active Francophone regiment at the front. "We know very well that we are heading to the slaughterhouse," wrote Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Louis Tremblay, their commander. "It must succeed for the honor of all French Canadians whom we represent in France." Against great odds, the Vendus were successful, taking Courcelette and holding it for 3 days, while surrounded by Germans. The Somme offensive dragged on for 5 months, ending on November 18th. What stopped it wasn't a decisive victory, but the weather. The rain and snow made fighting impossible. The ground became a sea of mud that swallowed men and tanks. Early snows brought the Battle of the Somme to an end on 18 November 1916. With the arrival of winter, large-scale offensive operations ceased, and both the Allies and Central Powers dug in, awaiting the arrival of spring. The 1st, 2nd, 4th, and 5th Australian divisions were garrisoned on the line east of Flers in the Somme Valley. The conditions here were the worst encountered by them throughout the war. Unusually heavy autumn rains had deluged the shell crater battlefield and turned it to an almost impassable quagmire. Private Edward Lynch described the desolated landscape. "We live in a world of Somme mud. We sleep in it, work in it, fight in it, wade in it, and many of us escape it, not even by dying." The 3rd Australian Division, after training in England, arrived in France on 21 November and went straight to a comparatively quiet section of the front line. The Battle of the Somme was followed by 8 weeks of continuous rain, sleet, and snow. While most troops were withdrawn to the rear areas for rest and refitting, those serving on the front lines, although frequently rotated, suffered greatly. The trenches provided no protection from the bitter winter. Abnormally low temperatures, especially at night, froze their clothes and blankets. Frequently, men were buried in trenches, collapsed by mudslides. In addition, they had to endure body lice and swarms of trench rats. The situation improved marginally in mid-January, when 4 weeks of sub-zero temperatures and clear skies froze the ground, bringing some respite to the muddy trenches. During that winter of 1916-17, the extreme weather and unsanitary condition of the trenches claimed substantially more casualties than the fighting. Trench foot, caused by prolonged standing in cold and dirty water, affected thousands of troops. Respiratory diseases, rheumatism, frostbite were also common. Martin Gilbert wrote, "On the night of November 17th, the snow fell on the Somme battlefield. On the following night, the final assault of the campaign took place. It was an advance of 1,000 yards along the Ancre River, tributary of the Somme. It was much hampered by mist and snow. After 4.5 months of struggle, suffering, and advance, there was no concluding victory, or even coda. One divisional history recorded that 2 companies had taken part in the assault on November 18th. They had disappeared entirely, being overwhelmed by machine gun fire." Hugh Strachan wrote, "After September, as the weather worsened and the mud hampered operation, the battle was again explained in terms of attrition. In truth, it should have been closed down." Wrote soldier Louis Bardis, "This ravine must have been the scene of fierce combats. The blasted tree trunks pulled out by their roots, shattered wagons and carts, all sorts of debris, rifles, bayonets, grenades, German shells scattered around or piled up. We marched past in silence, seemingly indifferent, under ceaseless rain, which soaked us through and through, which did not stop the cannonade. Bardas then participated in the storming of a German trench. He wrote, when the next day the fog lifted, the Germans were astounded to see the French a few steps away from them. On October 23, 1916. After November 18th, Bardas and his unit were rotated between the rear and front line of trenches under worsening weather and enemy shell fire. Even after November 18th, Bardas and his unit were rotated between the rear and front. They suffered worsening weather under enemy shell fire. He wrote, during these 5 days the torrential rain and snow never let up. The walls of the trench were sagging. The precarious shelters which men had dug for themselves collapsed at certain places. Trenches filled with water. It's useless to try to describe the suffering of men. Without shelter, soaked, pierced by cold, badly fed, no pen could tell their tale. You have had to live through these hours, these days, these nights to know how interminable they were in weather like this. Proceeding in nightly work details to and from the front line, men slipped and fell into shell holes filled with water and weren't able to climb out. They drowned or froze to death, their hands grasping at the edges of the crater in an effort to pull themselves out. Canberra man Albert Eddie Edwards joined the 1st Battalion on the front line near Ypres in Belgium in the aftermath of the bloody conflict at Pozières. 4 weeks later, in October 1916, as the weather was approaching, worsening, and rains set in, his battalion was sent to the Somme. To Edwards, the Somme was a nightmare where men lived a life of mud in a landscape of mud, never knowing for days together what it was to have a dry place to rest, or dry clothes, or dry boots to live in. His introduction to trench warfare on the Somme was 56 hours in 2 feet of water on an empty stomach. Yet the men were expected to attack the Germans despite the conditions. On the 5th of November, the 1st and 3rd Battalion attempted to straighten the front line near a position known as the Maze. To Edwards, it was preordained to fail. It rained like hell, he later wrote. Wet through the skin, frozen, stiff, mud to the knees, I could not see my hands in front of my face, and to fill our cup of discomfort, pressed down and flowing over. They reached the German trenches but could not hold them, and they were forced to retreat. Only 7 men from Edwards' platoon answered the roll call the next day. Life in the trenches was bleak. Edwards wrote, the very name of the Somme conveys visions of mud, mud, and then more mud. The men could not move around. If they walked or even stamped their feet to keep warm, the floor of the trench turned to thin mud in which they would sink even further. Cutting protective niches into the trench wall was forbidden as it caused the sides to collapse. Fires were banned. The frequent result of exposure to these cold, wet, and unsanitary conditions was trench foot. Trench foot was a disabling foot disorder resembling frostbite. If it was not treated, it could result in gangrene. In mid-January 1917, the winter freeze set in. It brought snow and colder temperatures yet. The mud froze. When O'Grady was sent to the trenches, he had to wear long wool underwear, long wool singlets, flannel shirts, corduroy knee breeches, puttees, long gumboots up to the thigh, next tunic, then sheepskin vest and glass great wool coat, all wool. After adding battle equipment, ammunition, and a balaclava, O'Grady was left to wonder how they were able to move at all. At the beginning of February 1917, the 1st Battalion was in the line near Butte de Warlencourt. Edwards recalled that it was so cold the company alternated front-line trench every 24 hours. The ground was so hard that 18-pound shells ricocheted without penetrating the surface, and the earth was frozen to a depth of 3 feet. The shell holes were a massive, solid wall of ice. By February 22nd, 1917, a thaw set in and rain began to fall. The winter of 1916 was one of the coldest recorded in France for decades. It had been a ghastly nightmare of mud, snow, and misery. However, something significant was occurring in the conflict zone. The Germans began to retreat to their nearly complete Hindenburg line, opening up a new phase in the war for the Australians and, in the end, for a time, of the fighting along the Somme. December 1916 had a CET, Central English temperature, of 1.9 degrees. This resulted in it being the coldest December since 1892. Colder Decembers have happened in modern times, like December 2010 and 1981. The cold conditions started to become afoot on the 9th as an area of low pressure pushed southeastwards over the UK and Ireland, forcing wind to turn into the northeast eventually. This led to significant accumulations of snowfall in various regions as it passed over both countries, including an observation of snow being over a foot deep at Marquis Castle. This low essentially got stuck in the same position for much of the week, but tended to weaken, with wind speeds dropping day by day, only further helping frost to form over time. Newcastle Wicklow had 34 millimeters of rain and snow on the 12th. There are instances of dense fog and thunderstorms with this unstable cold air mass. Kildare and Kilkenny got down to minus 7.2 on the 15th and 17th and 16th, respectively. Cahir, Coho, Tipperary got down to minus 7.8 on the 16th and again the 17th. So we have a very good idea of just how nasty some of that weather was in December and why eventually operations across the Western Front just kind of ceased, slowed down, ground down, and became just survive and fire the odd artillery round at each other. You'd be fooled into thinking that was the end of winter, as that was only the beginning. The winter was to get more severe as it went on, even as late as April. January 1917 had a CET of 1.6 degrees, joint coldest with 1897, exactly 20 years before. Since 1895, which had a CET of 0.2 degrees Celsius, a complete contrast to the preceding January. January 1916 had been the warmest January on record with a CET of 7.5 degrees Celsius, and still to this day is the mildest January in the entire Central English temperature record that dates back to 1659. January 1917 began where December 1916 left off, with mild temperatures and a flat southwesterly flow. There were reports of gales at Malin Head and in parts of Scotland on the 1st. A depression on the 3rd and 4th sank southeastwards, forcing winds to veer northwesterly and northerly. There were bouts of heavy rain over Scotland rather than snow, however, as much as 44 millimeters at Cruachan, Argyll. Flat westerly winds dominated for a few more days, with the Euro high attempting to retrogress westwards into the mid-Atlantic and up to Greenland. The 7th brought down a northerly gale to most places as a result of the depression marked east. Force 9 or 10 gusts occurred at many stations. The arrival of another depression on the 11th caused the gale to continue until the 13th on various parts of the coast. This unsettled period resulted in a mix of rain and snow to all districts. Here are some of the low temperatures taken in England by the UK Meteorological Office. Minus 20 at Benson on the 6th, 19.4 below at Wellington on the 6th. Also on the 6th, minus 16.7 at Ross on Wye. Gwernwick Fed, minus 16.7, 16.1 at Braemar, 16.8 below at West Linton on the 7th, minus 15.6 at Woburn, Boxton, 15 degrees below at Wisley, 13.9 below at Canterbury and Aldershot on the 3rd, and Aldershot in the 7th. In terms of the Battle of the Somme, in the end, the Allies had gained 13 kilometers of territory that held no strategic purpose whatsoever. They lost 600,000 men. The Germans lost some 440,000. Of the 100,000 Canadians who took part, 24,000 were dead or wounded. The Germans called the battle Das Blutbad, the bloodbath. Joffre lost his command because of the debacle, though it was later restored by George Clemenceau, president of the French Commission on Foreign Affairs. It baffles you. Haig kept his job. He suffered severe criticism nonetheless. The Battle of the Somme left a lasting mark on all who were there and changed the way trench warfare was conducted. The winter of 1916 and 17 was one of the most brutal, up until 1939, that Europe had seen in a long time. It's not always strategic brilliance that wins the day. Sometimes it's who can last the weather out. All right, that's all for this time. Please subscribe if you found this video interesting. We'll see you next time. Bye.